I'll first just touch on the now insulin resistance and obesity. I want to talk about fat cells, what hypertrophies them, what shrinks them, and the role that GLP-1, we've seen this rise of so many people now taking Ozempic and tirzepatide. And I want to know, I've never discussed on the podcast, I want to know what these drugs do in terms of insulin resistance.
Yeah, great. This is fun. You've unleashed me. So yeah, a lot of my view when it comes to insulin resistance and its chronic progression, there has been debate within the scientific field on this topic as to which tissue is the first one that becomes insulin resistant, which is the first domino to fall in the little stack that a child has put up, which is the first one that actually tips into the rest. Now, I would say the finger that tips the first one over is going to be the chronically elevated insulin. But even still, my finger tipping over the first domino is going to be the high insulin that we talked about earlier. But then still, one tissue needs to be the first one to really start suffering. And I very much embrace a fat first focus. It is the fat cells that become insulin resistant first. And it is all about how the fat cell grows. We commonly want to talk about fat as this just uniform, singular entity. And if you have more of it, you're insulin resistant and diabetic and hypertensive, etc. And if you have less of it, you're healthy. That is simply not true. If that were true, every woman would be more diabetic than every single man because women naturally have more fat than men as a consequence of her sex hormones. Women are naturally fatter than men, and yet they are metabolically bulletproof. A woman is a metabolic superhero, and that's all because it's not the mass of fat that matters most, it's the size of the fat cells. And because women have more fat cells than men do, as again, a consequence of their sex hormones, women actually are healthier. Now, this then gets to the discussion where if you took two people, in fact, when I did my fellowship with Duke University in medical school in diabetes research, it was in Singapore, of all places, the beautiful Southeast Asian island state. And within Singapore, there was an interest in understanding why various ethnicities have greater or lower risks of developing type 2 diabetes and all of these metabolic problems that come with insulin resistance. And part of the problem was found to be the size of the fat cell and the different propensities that various ethnicities have to store that fat. So, case in point, let's imagine there were two versions of me. There is the white European version of me, typical kind of American mix that I am. And then there was, let's say, an East Asian version of me, both living in Singapore, exact same body size, but one of me is more Chinese, one of me is more European. And we add 10 kilograms of fat onto both of these versions of Ben. The Caucasian version of Ben is perfectly healthy. My metabolic health is unaffected. I just don't look as good in my Speedo. East Asian version of Ben, with my Chinese background, you put those same 10 kilograms of fat on me, I am profoundly hypertensive, I have type 2 diabetes, I have fatty liver disease, and I have erectile dysfunction. All of these consequences of insulin resistance and probably many more. That's because Caucasians have the ability to make new fat cells. That's a process called hyperplasia, relatively more than other ethnicities do. And when you're making new fat cells, your fat mass is going up, but the size of each cell is relatively modest. And it's size that matters most, as I'll mention in a moment. In the East Asian version, there's very limited capacity to make new fat cells. Indeed, it's essentially none once you get into adulthood. Thus, any fat gain is occurring strictly through a process called hypertrophy, where the cells themselves are getting much, much bigger. Indeed, a fat cell can grow to a level that no other cell of the body can, where it can easily get 10 or 20 times bigger than it used to be. But then here is the problem. It gets so big that it's almost like a water balloon that a naughty little child is filling up at the faucet in the kitchen. The balloon's getting bigger and bigger, and it's about to pop. You keep dripping the water in, and the balloon's going to burst. The fat cell is having its own version of this, where its membrane can only expand so much before it would literally fall apart. And so insulin is what tells the fat cell to get big. And so it must stop listening to insulin, and thus it becomes insulin resistant. But let me just highlight that point with total clarity. we have been spoon-fed an idea that all fat growth or shrinking is a matter of too many calories or too few or fewer calories.
Yes, calories in,
calories out. That is the dogma that we've beaten to death. And yet I can prove that wrong in my lab any day of the week. You can have fat cells growing in a little petri dish filled with calories, all kinds of calories, and they will stay very skinny and small fat cells until we do one thing, which is add a little insulin. You sprinkle on a little insulin into those cells, and all of a sudden it's like putting fertilizer on your lawn and your plants in your garden, and everything starts to grow faster.
Can I just stop you right there? Because I have so many questions. First of all, you should talk to Lane Norton. Second of all, is that the same as when you hear women who are menopausal or perimenopausal say, I'm doing everything I can, and I just don't seem to be able to lose weight? Is that the same for that way as well?
Yeah, well, in a way it is. In fact, women who start to go through menopause start to become, earlier I referred to a woman being a metabolic superhero until she goes through menopause, then she's immortal. Now she is as weak metabolically as her male counterpart is, he's always been like this, but with the loss of estradiol in particular, and even some progesterone and estradiol will help her body burn more belly fat while storing more on the gluteofemoral or the buttocks and hips, but also to make new fat cells when needed. That's why the woman has more fat cells than her male counterpart, but they're all smaller. So she has more fat, but smaller fat cells. But again, with menopause, with that transition, we have the loss of those sex hormones, and now she starts to store more fat on her belly. But at the same time of that happening in life, within the next 10 years or so, the number of fat cells that adults have starts to go down. Now that sounds like a good thing, but if the person continues to eat the same way they were before, then all of the remaining fat cells are getting bigger and bigger. Now, let me just say that as much as there is challenge to my idea, what I've been saying about insulin and fat cells, I can prove it definitively at the level of the cell. But someone would say, well, what about humans? We can do the same, that the lower the insulin level gets, the more and more impossible it becomes for the fat tissue to grow. And we see this in type 1 diabetes. A type 1 diabetic can eat 10,000 calories a day. And if they deliberately underdose, not even zero, but just deliberately underdose their insulin, they will be as skinny as they want. Their metabolic rate goes up substantially. They start to breathe and urinate out ketones, and ketones have calories in them as well. So whenever a person's in ketosis, the body begins to have to reconcile its inability to store energy, and thus it starts wasting it. And we see this happen in whole humans. In my lab, from human tissue, we found that when a person's in ketosis, their metabolic rate in their fat tissue is about 3 times higher than when they're not in ketosis. So all of this helps us appreciate that it is the size of the fat cell. And maybe one last comment before transitioning to GLP-1s. Once again, to the type 1 diabetic, a type 1 diabetic is given many pieces of advice, some of which is terrible when they're first diagnosed, some is good. One piece of good advice to the type 1 diabetic is to rotate your injection sites. They're told to never inject their insulin in the same place all the time. And that is because of what insulin does to fat cells. There are multiple papers published from labs in Japan looking at type 2 diabetic patients, type 1 or type 2, if they're taking insulin, and in people who did not rotate their injection sites, and you can see how much bigger the fat cells are in the cells that were getting the insulin injection compared to fat cells just a few centimeters away. In this, like you look on the belly, this spot here was getting the insulin injection, this spot here wasn't, and these fat cells are substantially bigger, so much bigger that it looks like the person has a tumor in their fat tissue bulging out of their belly, but it's just this oddly exaggerated fat growth because of all the insulin. So to look at the fat cell, in order for fat cell to grow, and this is sort of my conciliatory diplomatic way of accommodating these various perspectives. Some will say fat only grows through calories. It's the only thing that matters. My counter to that is, no, there must be some hormone signal, namely insulin, that tells the fat what to do with those calories, with that energy. And this is where it all comes together. In order for a fat cell to grow, and fat mass to go up at all, you have to have two parts to this. One, you must have elevated insulin. The elevated insulin is what tells the fat cell that it's time to eat and store. The cell is not inherently rational. It doesn't know what to do with the energy. It's a naughty little child who doesn't know what to do with what it has. It needs to be told what to do. Insulin tells the fat cell it's time to grow. Now, having received that signal, the fat cell must have something to grow with, and thus the calories become relevant. But in the absence of even one of those, it becomes impossible. If a person has no insulin but high calories, it doesn't matter. That's the untreated type 1 diabetic that I talked about earlier. It's impossible to gain fat. In contrast, if a person had high insulin but insufficient calories, they would die, actually, from profound hypoglycemia, and no ketones, and the brain would starve and they would go unconscious or die shortly after if it wasn't corrected. So you cannot have one without the other. It doesn't work. If they're both elevated, now you are cooking with gas, as we may say, and the fat cells are going to grow very, very quickly. So all of this brings us to what are the best strategies to shrink the fat cell, because it's fat cell shrinking that improves insulin sensitivity. And that one brings some people to the GLP-1 drugs. Of course, dietary changes are the best way to do it. You want to control carbs in order to lower insulin, and then have some degree of fasting or some degree of restriction when you need to. You don't want to be eating all the time. Both of those are going to be helpful, and GLP-1 receptor agonists, as a new class of drug, relatively new, is a very effective way to do that pharmacologically, albeit with consequences that should be noted. As much as I do believe very firmly that it ought to be just dietary changes in the absence of drug, ideally, I acknowledge that in some people that is very, very hard, because in some instances we're dealing with very deep-seated dietary addictions that are not so easy. Because if I were to tell someone the simplest, best way to lower your insulin is to control carbs, the next words out of their mouth are going to be something like, I can't, or that's the one thing I struggle with the most. No one is sitting around on a Saturday night craving a plate of bacon and eggs. If only humans showed addictive or craving tendencies towards proteins and fats. We only show it. All of the neurobiology of food addiction has focused on carbs. That is one of the most consistent findings with food addictions. It's always carbs. Carbs alone or carbs with fat. Carbs is the common denominator here. So easier said than done. That is where I think GLP-1 medications can be helpful at the lowest possible effective dose, just to try to help a person learn to eat a little differently. But at the doses they're being used now, yes, you will lose weight, primarily because you just stop eating. You feel so nauseous because your stomach, your intestines have slowed down so much that you have food that's sitting and festering in your stomach. What should have only been there for 4 or 5 hours is there for 20 or 24 hours.
Oh my God.
And so you start to feel quite sick, and thus you don't eat. What we say, someone will say, I started taking the drug and my cravings went away. That's sort of a nice way of saying I started to really feel sick to my stomach. And so I didn't want to continue. In fact, people feel so sick that they get sick of feeling sick. In the US, 70%, in the UK, it's at 68% of patients who use these drugs. At 2 years, 70% or 68% have gotten off the drug of their own volition.
And have they regained the weight?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
See,
it is the problem, especially because of what they lose. Just this week, there was a paper finding that GLP-1 shrinks heart muscle. There was already a paper published 2 years ago in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine that found that up to 40% of weight loss is coming from fat-free mass.
Oh my gosh.
When a person regains weight, you think about it, if we're losing fat mass, for every 10 kilos, 6 kilos is coming from fat, 4 kilos is coming from fat-free mass. If 2 years in, I decide to get off the drug because I'm sick of feeling sick, 2 years later, I essentially have gained it all back. One of these comes back very quickly, and that's the fat mass. Imagine a middle-aged or older woman, her ability to regain any lost muscle and bone is essentially zero. Not totally zero, but it is going to be extraordinarily difficult for her to ever recover any loss of bone and muscle as she gets into her 60s or so. It is possible a little, but not entirely.
So the main mechanism of action of these GLP-1s is satiety. And because of satiety, you're not eating as much. You're probably in such a calorie deficit. Therefore, your muscles have nothing to feed off, so they waste away. Muscle is extremely energy consuming. It needs to be fed, really. You probably don't have that much energy, so you're not going to the gym. And most people are really not lifting as heavy to achieve a hypertrophy response. So we've got that. Okay, that's scary, and that's something that I hate.